The room was full of quiet noise, the kind that happens when many people gather in one place but no one is really paying attention to anyone else. Cups touched saucers with soft clicks. Chairs moved across the floor with light scraping sounds. Small conversations floated through the air like scattered pieces of music that never quite formed a song. Near the large windows, sunlight spilled across the polished floor. The afternoon was calm, and the warm light made everything look softer than usual. People sat in small groups, talking about work, plans for the evening, and ordinary things that filled their day. In the center of the room stood something that always caught attention for a moment before people went back to their own lives. The piano. It was a beautiful instrument, dark and glossy, standing quietly as if waiting for someone to notice it. The keys looked smooth and perfect under the soft lights above it. Many people passed by it during the day. Some stopped to look. A few even took pictures beside it. But very few ever sat down to play. It was more like decoration than anything else. Every now and then someone would press a random key just to hear the sound echo through the space, but that was usually the end of it. That afternoon seemed no different from any other. People came in and out of the room without much thought. A group of friends laughed loudly near the far wall. A man sat alone scrolling through his phone. Another person worked on a laptop while sipping coffee slowly. The piano remained silent until the door opened again. A young girl stepped inside. At first, no one really noticed her. She moved quietly, almost carefully, like someone who didn't want to disturb anything around her. Her clothes were simple and slightly worn, the kind people often overlook without a second thought. She paused near the entrance for a moment, looking around the room. Her eyes moved slowly across the tables, the people, and finally toward the piano in the middle of the space. Something about the way she looked at it felt different. Most people glanced at the piano the way they might look at a painting on the wall. But the way this girl looked at it was not casual at all. It was focused, almost emotional, as if the instrument meant something important to her. She took a few steps forward. The room continued its normal rhythm. Conversations carried on. Cups clinked against plates. Someone laughed loudly at something on a phone screen. But the girl walked slowly toward the piano, as if she had already made a quiet decision inside her mind. When she reached it, she stopped. For a moment she simply stood there. Her eyes studied the piano carefully, from the smooth black surface to the long line of white and black keys. The instrument reflected the light from above, making it look even more beautiful. She lifted one hand and gently touched the edge of the piano, not in a careless way, more like someone greeting an old friend. A nearby table noticed her first. Two people sitting there looked up from their conversation and watched her curiously. One of them raised an eyebrow slightly. The girl didn't seem to notice them. Her attention remained on the piano. She walked around the bench slowly and stood behind it for a moment. It looked like she was thinking. Then she carefully pulled the bench out. The quiet sound of the wooden legs sliding across the floor reached a few nearby ears. More heads turned. Someone whispered something to a friend. A small smile appeared on another person's face, the kind that comes from expecting something amusing. The girl sat down on the bench. She adjusted her position slightly, sitting up straight but still looking a little unsure of herself. A few people began watching more closely now. One man leaned back in his chair with curiosity. Someone else nudged their friend lightly with an elbow and pointed toward the piano. The girl placed her hands on her lap. For a moment she did nothing. The room continued moving around her. More people began noticing. Some of them looked confused. Others looked entertained. It wasn't common to see someone like her sitting at such a beautiful instrument in a place like this. That alone was enough to catch attention. A quiet chuckle came from one table. Someone whispered something that caused another person to laugh softly. The girl heard the laughter. It was impossible not to, but she didn't react. Instead, she lowered her eyes toward the keys. The piano waited silently in front of her. For a few seconds she simply looked at it. It almost seemed like she was remembering something. Across the room, a couple of people had already taken out their phones. One person lifted their camera slightly, expecting something funny or awkward to happen. Another voice whispered jokingly, This should be interesting. The girl slowly lifted her hands. She didn't place them on the keys yet. They hovered slightly above them. Her fingers were thin but steady. She took a slow breath. If anyone had been close enough to hear it, they might have noticed that it wasn't the breath of someone afraid. It was the breath of someone gathering courage. But most people in the room didn't notice that. They were too busy waiting for something to laugh about. Someone quietly joked that she might not even know how to play. Another person smiled in anticipation of a random, clumsy sound. The girl still hadn't touched the keys. The room buzzed softly with expectation. For a brief moment it looked like she might stand up and walk away. Her hands lowered slightly. Then she closed her eyes. Just for a second. When she opened them again, something had changed in her expression. The nervousness was still there, but it had been replaced by something stronger. Focus. Her fingers gently moved forward. And finally they touched the keys. The first sound had not come yet. But in that quiet second before the music began, no one in the room realized they were about to witness something they would remember for a very long time. Her fingers rested lightly on the keys, but the music had not started yet. The room still carried the same soft noise of conversations, clinking cups, and quiet laughter. Some people were now clearly watching her, curious about what would happen next. A man sitting near the window leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. He looked at the girl and then at the piano, as if trying to figure out what kind of performance was about to happen. At another table, two people exchanged amused glances. One of them whispered something under their breath, and both of them smiled. A few others nearby noticed the moment as well. The sight of the girl sitting at such a beautiful instrument seemed unusual to them. To many of them, she looked too young and too uncertain to be doing something like this in front of strangers. Someone quietly said, "Let's see how this goes." Another person laughed softly. The girl heard the laughter again, but her expression didn't change much. Her shoulders were slightly tense, but she kept her eyes on the piano keys as if the rest of the room didn't exist. She adjusted her hands slightly. The piano bench creaked a little when she shifted her weight. The sound was small, but in that moment it seemed louder because so many people were watching. More heads began turning. Even those who were not paying attention before were now curious. A group sitting farther away noticed the small crowd looking toward the piano and began watching as well. One person lifted a phone and pointed the camera toward the girl. It wasn't out of admiration. It was more like they expected something awkward to happen. Sometimes people enjoy watching moments that seem uncomfortable for others. It becomes a kind of entertainment. The girl still had not played a single note. Her fingers were gently resting on the keys now, but they were still. The room slowly grew quieter. Not silent, but quieter than before. One person whispered, "Maybe she changed her mind." Another person replied quietly, "Or maybe she doesn't know what to play." A soft chuckle followed. The girl lowered her head slightly, looking closely at the keyboard. The smooth white keys stretched across the piano like a long path. For a moment her fingers moved back slightly, almost as if she might pull her hands away. But she didn't. Instead, she pressed the first key. The sound was soft. So soft that at first it almost blended with the noise in the room. But then another note followed. And another. The melody started slowly, simple and gentle. At first, most people didn't react. Some were still whispering. A few were still smiling as if waiting for the music to fall apart into random mistakes. But something unexpected began to happen. The notes were steady, careful. They were not the uncertain sounds of someone pressing keys without knowing what they were doing. There was rhythm. There was feeling. One person near the piano stopped smiling. They tilted their heads slightly, listening more closely. Another person lowered their phone just a little. The melody continued to grow. The girl's fingers moved slowly across the keys. Not fast, but smooth and confident. Each note connected to the next in a way that felt natural, almost like the music had been waiting to come out. A few more people stopped talking. One conversation near the back of the room faded into silence as the people there turned their chairs slightly toward the piano. The laughter that had filled the room earlier was now disappearing. Someone whispered quietly, "Wait, Listen. The girl still didn't look up. Her attention remained on the piano. But something about the way she played had changed. The nervous tension that had been visible before seemed to fade away with every note. Her fingers moved with more confidence now. The melody grew deeper, more emotional. It was no longer just a few careful notes. It was music. Real music. The kind that slowly pulls attention without asking for it. The man sitting near the window leaned forward slightly now. He was no longer watching for entertainment. He was listening. Across the room, a woman who had been typing on a laptop slowly stopped working. Her hands rested on the keyboard, but her eyes had moved toward the piano. Even the people who had been whispering jokes earlier were now quiet. The girl continued playing. Her hands moved more freely across the keys. The sound of the piano filled the room in a way that felt warm and powerful at the same time. It was not loud, but it carried emotion. Every note seemed to tell a small piece of a story. People began realizing something surprising. The girl they had quietly laughed at only minutes earlier knew exactly what she was doing. A few people exchanged looks again, but this time their expressions were different. There was confusion, and maybe a little embarrassment. One person quietly said, "She's actually good." Another person nodded slowly. The phones that had been raised earlier were now recording for a different reason. Not to capture something awkward, but to capture something impressive. The melody continued to grow, filling the space with a calm but powerful energy. The girl's posture had changed too. She was no longer sitting like someone unsure of herself. Now she looked comfortable, almost at home in front of the piano. Her shoulders relaxed. Her fingers moved faster now, gliding over the keys in smooth patterns. The music carried through the room, reaching every corner. Even the people who had not noticed her earlier were now paying attention. The entire atmosphere of the room had shifted. The laughter was gone. The whispers had stopped. In its place was quiet attention. People were listening. Really listening. The girl still didn't look up. She seemed completely focused on the music. It was as if the piano and the melody were the only things that existed for her in that moment. But the room around her had completely changed. The same people who had expected a mistake were now waiting to hear what would come next. And slowly, one by one, they were beginning to realize something important. The moment they had thought would be funny was turning into something unforgettable. The melody continued to flow through the room, soft but powerful at the same time. What had started as a few gentle notes was now turning into something deeper. The girl's fingers moved across the keys with calm confidence, as if she had played this piano many times before. The strange thing was that only a few minutes earlier, most people in the room had been expecting the opposite. They had been waiting for mistakes, for awkward sounds, for a moment they could laugh about later. But that moment never came. Instead, the music grew stronger. Each note connected smoothly with the next one. The rhythm felt natural, almost like a quiet conversation between the girl and the piano. The sound filled the room without being too loud, yet it carried far enough that even people sitting at the far tables could hear it clearly. A man who had been scrolling through his phone slowly stopped moving his fingers. He looked up at the piano, listening carefully now. Near the window, the man who had folded his arms earlier had leaned forward in his chair. His eyes followed the movement of the girl's hands as they glided across the keyboard. The group that had been laughing earlier was no longer laughing. They were watching. The girl herself seemed unaware of how much attention she had now. Her eyes remained focused on the keys, and her expression looked calm and thoughtful. Her fingers moved gently at first, pressing each key with care. Then the melody began to change. It became slightly faster, not rushed, but more alive. The music began to rise and fall like waves moving across water. Some notes sounded soft and emotional, while others carried a stronger feeling that made people sit up a little straighter in their chairs. One woman near the middle of the room placed her coffee cup down slowly. She had been holding it halfway to her lips, but she stopped when she realized she was more interested in listening. Another person who had been typing on a laptop pushed the screen down slightly so they could see the piano more clearly. The room was becoming quieter with every passing second. It wasn't a forced silence. No one had asked people to stop talking. It simply happened on its own. The music had taken their attention without asking for it. The girl's hands moved smoothly now, sometimes traveling to the higher keys where the sound became light and bright, then moving back to the deeper notes that gave the melody warmth and depth. Every movement looked natural, like breathing, like something she had done thousands of times before. A person standing near the door quietly whispered to their friend, "How old do you think she is?" The friend shook their head slightly, still watching the piano. "It doesn't matter," they said softly. "Just listen." The girl pressed a small group of keys together, and the sound echoed gently through the room. The notes hung in the air for a moment before fading into the next part of the melody. Now the music carried emotion that people could feel. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was a story. Some listeners began to feel a strange quiet feeling inside them, the kind that appears when music reminds people of something they cannot easily explain. One older man sitting alone at a small table closed his eyes for a moment while listening. He didn't even realize he had done it. The melody had simply pulled him in. Across the room, the person who had started recording earlier was still holding their phone up, but their expression had changed. Their smile had disappeared, replaced by something closer to amazement. No one was expecting this. The girl leaned slightly closer to the piano as the melody continued. Her fingers now moved faster, but still smoothly, never hitting the wrong keys. The music grew richer. Some parts sounded hopeful and bright, while others carried a quiet sadness that made people listen even more closely. A small child sitting at a nearby table stopped swinging their legs under the chair. Even they seemed to sense that something special was happening. The room, which had once been full of chatter and movement, was now almost completely silent. Only the piano could be heard. The girl's shoulders moved slightly as she played, following the rhythm of the melody. She looked comfortable now, like someone who had forgotten that a crowd was watching. In that moment, she wasn't a shy girl sitting in a busy room. She was simply someone sharing music. And the room was listening. A few people slowly stood up from their chairs without realizing it. They moved closer to the piano, curious to see the hands creating such beautiful sound. No one laughed anymore. The earlier whispers and jokes now felt distant and unimportant. The girl continued playing, her fingers moving with growing confidence. The melody began building towards something bigger. The notes rose higher, becoming brighter and more powerful. People could feel the change coming, like the moment before a wave reaches the shore. The man near the window shook his head quietly, almost in disbelief. He had expected something completely different when the girl first sat down. Now he watched her hands with quiet respect. Another person leaned toward their friend and whispered softly, "She's incredible." But the girl still didn't look up. She remained focused on the keys, letting the music guide her hands. The piano seemed to respond to every movement. The sound filled the space in a way that made the room feel smaller, warmer, and more connected. In only a few minutes, everything had changed. The people who had been strangers before were now sharing the same quiet moment together. And it was all because of the girl sitting at the piano. As the melody continued rising toward its next powerful moment, the listeners realized something important. The girl they had barely noticed when she walked in had just turned an ordinary afternoon into something unforgettable. The music continued to move through the room like a quiet wave. By now, almost everyone inside had stopped whatever they were doing. Conversations had faded away, phones were lowered, and even the soft clinking of cups had stopped. The only sound that remained was the piano. The girl sat calmly at the bench, her fingers moving across the keys with a natural rhythm. She no longer looked nervous the way she had when she first sat down. Now she looked focused, as if the music had pulled her into another world where the whispers and laughter from earlier no longer mattered. Some people in the room watched her hands closely. Others simply closed their eyes and listened. The melody grew richer with each passing moment. There was something about the way she played that made people feel like the music meant more than just notes on a piano. Felt personal. Felt honest. The girl pressed a series of soft keys, and the melody slowed for a moment, almost like it was taking a quiet breath. Across the room, The man who had been watching from the window leaned forward again. His expression had completely changed from earlier. The amused look he once had was gone. Now there was only quiet curiosity and respect. A woman sitting near the center of the room folded her hands together on the table and listened carefully. Something about the music felt familiar to her, even though she had never heard it before. The girl continued playing, her fingers moving smoothly between the higher and lower keys. Every movement looked natural, like someone telling a story they knew by heart. And in many ways, that was exactly what she was doing. Because the truth was, the music she played carried pieces of her life inside it. Long before she had walked into this room, the piano had already been part of her story. Years earlier, there had been a small community building on the edge of a quiet neighborhood. It was not a fancy place. The paint on the walls was slightly faded, and the rooms were simple. But inside that building, there had been one thing that made it special. An old piano. It had scratches on the wood and a few keys that didn't sound as bright as the others. It had clearly been used for many years. But for the girl, it had always looked beautiful. The first time she saw it, she had stood in front of it for a long time, just staring at the keys the same way she had stared at the piano in the room today. At that time, she had been younger and even quieter than she was now. Most children in the community center preferred playing outside or running through the halls with their friends. But the girl often wandered into the small room where the piano stood. At first she didn't play. She simply listened. Sometimes an older volunteer would sit down and play simple songs for the children. The music would echo softly through the hallway, and the girl would stand nearby, watching every movement of their hands. She watched the way fingers touched the keys, how certain notes sounded together, and how the music changed with different rhythms. One day, when the room was empty, she slowly sat down at the piano bench. Her feet barely reached the floor. She placed her fingers on the keys the same way she had seen others do. The first sound she made was not perfect. It was just a simple note, but she smiled when she heard it. From that moment, something inside her had changed. The piano became more than just an instrument. It became a place where she felt calm. Whenever the community center was quiet, she would sit there and press the keys one by one, slowly learning how the sounds worked together. Sometimes the volunteer would notice her practicing and offer small bits of advice. Nothing formal, just simple encouragement. Try pressing these two notes together. Listen to how the melody moves. Take your time. The girl listened carefully to every word. She practiced again and again. Even when the piano sounded a little out of tune, she continued playing. Sometimes she stayed until the building closed for the day. The staff at the center didn't mind. They could see how much the music meant to her. As the years passed, her playing slowly improved. The melodies she created became smoother. Her fingers moved with more confidence. She began remembering songs she had heard before and playing them from memory. But music was not just something she practiced when life felt easy. In difficult moments, the piano became even more important. Whenever she felt worried or overwhelmed, she would sit down and let the music carry those feelings away. The notes became a way to speak without words. Back in the room where she played now, the girl's fingers continued moving across the keys. The melody had grown deeper and more emotional. The people listening could feel it. Even though they didn't know her story, they could sense that the music came from somewhere real. The girl leaned slightly closer to the piano as the melody rose again. Her hands moved faster now, gliding across the keyboard in smooth patterns. The sound filled the room completely. People stood quietly, watching and listening with full attention. The earlier laughter now felt like it belonged to another moment entirely. No one could believe how different everything had become. The girl who had walked in quietly, the one many people had doubted, was now holding the entire room in silence with nothing but music. And the most surprising part was that she still played as if she were alone. Her focus never left the piano. The melody continued building slowly, rising toward something powerful that the listeners could feel approaching. And as the music carried through the air, one thing became clear to everyone in the room. This was not just a girl pressing piano keys. This was someone sharing a piece of her life through music. And the room was listening to every note. The music continued to rise and fall through the room, and by now it felt like time itself had slowed down. No one was looking at their phones anymore. Conversations had completely disappeared. Even the people who had just walked into the room paused near the door, confused at first by the silence, then slowly turning their heads toward the piano. The girl remained seated at the bench, her back straight but relaxed. Her fingers moved with a steady rhythm, sometimes light and delicate, sometimes stronger and more powerful. Each note seemed to flow naturally into the next. People who had been sitting began standing quietly, one by one. They moved a little closer to the piano, careful not to make noise that might interrupt the moment. It felt as if everyone had agreed without speaking that the music deserved their full attention. Near the window, the man who had earlier watched with curiosity now stood with his hands resting on the back of a chair. His eyes followed the girl's hands carefully. He had heard piano music before, of course. Many people had, but something about this performance felt different. It wasn't about showing off skill or playing loudly to impress a crowd. It felt honest. Across the room, a woman who had been quietly listening wiped the corner of one eye. She didn't even seem to realize she had done it. The melody carried emotion that people could feel deep inside. The girl pressed a group of keys softly, and the music dropped into a calm, gentle moment. It was almost like the sound was whispering. The entire room leaned into that quiet feeling. Then slowly, the melody began to build again. Her fingers moved faster across the keyboard now, but they never looked rushed. Each movement was smooth and confident. The piano responded with bright, clear notes that filled the air. Someone near the back of the room shook their head in amazement. Another person whispered quietly, "How did we not see this coming?" The earlier laughter now felt almost embarrassing to those who had joined in. They remembered the moment the girl had first sat down. The amused looks, the quiet jokes, the assumption that nothing good could come from it. But now the truth was right in front of them. The girl continued playing, completely focused on the music. She didn't look up once. It was as if she had forgotten that anyone else was even there. The melody rose higher and higher, becoming stronger with every passing second. The sound echoed gently against the walls and windows, filling every corner of the room. Even the people outside in the hallway had begun peeking through the doorway, curious about the music they could hear. Inside the room, the atmosphere felt almost magical. A child who had been sitting with their family stood quietly beside the table, eyes wide while watching the piano. The child didn't fully understand the music, but they could feel that something special was happening. The girl leaned slightly closer to the keys as the melody moved toward its most powerful moment. Her fingers traveled quickly across the keyboard now, dancing over the white and black keys with a rhythm that felt alive. The music was no longer soft background sound. It had become the heartbeat of the entire room. Every listener felt connected to it. A man standing near the back crossed his arms slowly, nodding his head in quiet respect. Someone else who had been recording earlier adjusted their phone carefully, trying to capture every second. But even those recording knew that a phone could never fully capture what the room felt like in that moment. The girl's hands moved through one final rising section of the melody. The notes climbed higher, brighter, stronger. People could feel the ending approaching, but no one wanted it to end. The music had turned an ordinary afternoon into something unforgettable. For a few minutes, everyone in that room had forgotten their schedules, their conversations, their distractions. They were simply listening. The girl pressed a series of final notes that rang clearly through the air. Then the melody slowed. The pace softened again. Her fingers moved more gently now, like someone carefully closing a story. Each note lingered slightly longer than the last. The room remained perfectly still. No one moved. No one spoke. It felt as if even breathing too loudly might disturb the final moment of the performance. The girl pressed one last soft group of keys. The final note floated gently into the air. For a brief second, it echoed through the room. Then it faded away. Her hands slowly lifted from the keyboard. They hovered above the keys for a moment before resting quietly in her lap. The music had ended, but the silence that followed felt even louder than the performance itself. For several seconds, no one reacted. People looked at each other as if they were making sure the moment was truly over. The girl remained seated, calm and quiet, staring down at the piano keys. She looked almost the same as she had when she first sat down. Except now, the room around her had completely changed. The same people who had once expected a mistake were now standing in silence, trying to process what they had just heard. Then, from somewhere near the middle of the room, a pair of hands began to clap. The sound was small at first, just two hands coming together, but it broke the silence. Another person began clapping, then another. Within seconds, the entire room filled with applause. People clapped loudly, some even cheering softly. The sound grew stronger and stronger, echoing through the space just as the piano music had moments earlier. The girl looked up for the first time since she had started playing. Her expression showed quiet surprise. She hadn't expected such a reaction. But the applause continued. Many of the people standing nearby smiled warmly at her now. The laughter from earlier was gone completely. In its place was something very different. Respect and admiration. The girl had walked into the room unnoticed. She had sat down at the piano while people doubted her. And now, with nothing but music, she had completely changed the way everyone in that room saw her. The applause continued, filling the air with a kind of energy that only happens when people witness something truly special. And in that moment, everyone knew they had just experienced something they would remember for a long time. The applause continued to echo through the room, louder than anything that had been heard there that afternoon. People clapped with real excitement now, not just polite appreciation. Some were even shaking their heads in disbelief, still trying to understand how such a quiet moment had turned into something so powerful. The girl remained seated at the piano bench for a moment, looking slightly surprised by the reaction around her. Her hands rested gently in her lap, and she glanced down at the keys as if the music had just ended in her own world. But the room around her was very much alive. People who had been sitting earlier were now standing. Some had stepped closer to the piano without realizing it. Others were smiling at her in a way they hadn't before. The man near the window clapped slowly, his eyes still fixed on the piano. His earlier curiosity had now turned into deep respect. Nearby, someone who had recorded part of the performance lowered their phone and joined the applause with both hands. The sound filled every corner of the room. After a few moments, the girl slowly stood up from the bench. She looked around at the crowd, clearly not expecting so many people to be watching her. For a brief second, she looked unsure of what to do. But then she gave a small, polite smile. It wasn't a big dramatic gesture, just a simple smile of gratitude. The applause continued. Some people began speaking to each other again, but their voices were filled with excitement now. "Did you hear that?" someone said quietly. "I can't believe how good she was," another person replied. A few people stepped forward carefully, approaching the piano as if they didn't want to interrupt something important. One person near the front spoke gently. "That was beautiful," they said with a warm smile. The girl nodded slightly, still looking a little shy with so much attention suddenly around her. Another person shook their head in amazement. "We thought you were just sitting down to try a few notes," they admitted. "But that was incredible." The girl looked down for a moment, almost embarrassed by the compliments. She hadn't come into the room expecting praise. She had simply wanted to play, and now the entire room was talking about it. Across the space, some of the same people who had laughed earlier were standing quietly. Their expressions were different now. The jokes and whispers from before seemed far away. One of them stepped forward slowly. They rubbed the back of their neck for a moment, clearly feeling a little awkward. "I guess we were wrong," they said honestly. The girl looked at them for a second, then gave a small understanding smile. There was no anger in her expression, no frustration, just quiet kindness. The music had already said everything that needed to be said. Another person asked softly, "Where did you learn to play like that?" The girl glanced back at the piano keys for a moment before answering. "Just practice," she said simply. Her voice was calm and humble. She didn't mention the old piano in the community building. She didn't talk about the many quiet afternoons spent learning each note slowly. She didn't explain how music had become a place of comfort during difficult times. All of that was already inside the music people had heard. The room slowly returned to its normal rhythm again. People moved back toward their tables, but something had clearly changed. Conversations were now about the performance they had just witnessed. Even those who hadn't been paying attention at first were asking others what had happened. Near the piano, a small group of listeners still stood nearby, smiling and talking quietly. One older man who had closed his eyes earlier during the performance stepped closer to the girl. He nodded respectfully. "That music meant something," he said gently. "You can always tell when someone plays from the heart." The girl listened quietly, then nodded in return. She understood exactly what he meant. For her, music had never been about showing off. It had always been about feeling. After a few more moments, the girl carefully pushed the piano bench back into place. Her hand rested briefly on the edge of the instrument, just like when she had first walked up to it. Only now the room around her felt very different. She had walked in unnoticed. People had doubted her before she even played a single note. Some had laughed quietly. Others had expected a mistake. But none of those things mattered anymore. The music had changed everything. As she stepped away from the piano, people nearby made space for her with friendly smiles. A few even clapped again softly as she passed by. The girl felt a little shy about the attention, but she also felt something warm inside. Not pride, more like quiet happiness. She had shared something important to her, and people had listened. As she walked toward the door, the man near the window spoke one last time. "You turned the whole room silent," he said with a smile. The girl paused for a moment and looked back at the piano. For a second, the sunlight from the window reflected off the black surface of the instrument, making it glow softly. Then she looked back at the man and nodded politely. Sometimes the most powerful moments happen when people least expect them. An ordinary afternoon. A quiet girl walking into a busy room. A piano that had been sitting there unnoticed. And a few simple notes that slowly turned into something unforgettable. By the time the girl stepped outside, the conversations inside the room were still filled with excitement about what had happened. Many people would tell that story later. They would remember how they had first laughed when the girl sat at the piano, and how only minutes later, the entire room had fallen completely silent. Not because anyone told them to be quiet, but because the music was simply too beautiful to interrupt. And for everyone who had been there that day, it became a small but powerful reminder. Sometimes the people others overlook are the ones who carry the most extraordinary gifts.